Do you remember when the Beatles felt untouchable, like nothing in the world could ever break them? But behind the music that defined a generation, there was a reality far more complicated than anyone imagined. Now, at 83, Ringo Starr is opening up about the side of their story fans rarely hear, growing tension, emotional distance, and the quiet struggles that built up over time. I felt like a stranger in my own band. And that's only the beginning, because beyond their fame and influence, each member faced moments of loss, pressure, and personal battles that would leave lasting scars long after the music stopped. The Lennon family's feud. None of the members of the Beatles came from easy beginnings, but John Lennon arguably had one of the most complicated childhoods. Born in 1940, he grew up without much of a stable father figure, as his dad Alfred was rarely around during his early years. Instead, John found himself caught between two very different women, his free-spirited mother, Julia, and his strict Aunt Mimi, both trying to shape his upbringing in completely opposite ways. One of the most defining moments of his childhood came when he was just 5 years old. His father forced him to choose between staying with him or going with his mother. John initially chose his father, but when Julia walked away, he couldn't bear it. He ran after her, crying. Not long after that, Alfred disappeared from his life almost entirely, only returning years later once John had already become famous. Those early experiences left a mark. As a teenager, John became rebellious and difficult, often getting into trouble, forming gangs, and pushing against authority both at school and at home. That defiant edge didn't fade. It became part of who he was, shaping the attitude the world would later see as both his strength and his struggle. Starr's Dickensian childhood. While John Lennon had a difficult childhood, Ringo Starr went through something even more brutal. Born Richard Starkey, he was only 4 years old when his father left, and not long after, his life became a cycle of illness and isolation. As a child, he suffered from serious health problems, appendicitis, then peritonitis, which kept him in a hospital bed for nearly a year, and later tuberculosis, forcing him to spend 2 more years in a sanatorium, completely cut off from normal life. But somehow, that same place became the turning point. During his recovery, his stepfather encouraged his growing interest in music, giving him something to focus on beyond the loneliness. A few years later, in 1957, Ringo received his first drum kit, a gift that would quietly change everything. From there, things began to fall into place. He joined local bands, developed his own style, and eventually adopted the name Ringo Starr. Not long after, while playing in Germany, he crossed paths with a rising group of young musicians performing in Hamburg, the Beatles. That meeting would change his life and music history forever. Their disastrous first residency. In the early 1960s, long before the Beatles became a global phenomenon, they were just another struggling group trying to get noticed. One of their first big breaks came when their manager at the time, Alan Williams, helped them land a residency at the Indra Club in Hamburg through his connection with club owner Bruno Koschmider. It sounded like a huge opportunity, but it quickly turned into a nightmare. Back then, the band still included John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Pete Best, and Stuart Sutcliffe. Their living conditions were rough. They slept in bunk beds inside a cramped storeroom behind a theater, played exhausting sets night after night, and earned barely enough to get by. To keep up with the relentless schedule, they even relied on stimulants just to stay awake. But things really fell apart when they accepted an offer to play at a rival club, angering Koschmider. In retaliation, he reported George Harrison to the authorities for being underage, which led to his deportation. Not long after, Paul McCartney and Pete Best were also arrested and sent home after being accused of starting a small fire. What was supposed to be their breakthrough moment ended in chaos, and for a while, it looked like the band might not survive it at all. The Lost Beatles. It was during those intense Hamburg days that the band's bassist, Stuart Sutcliffe, met photographer Astrid Kirchherr. The connection was immediate, and within just a couple of months, they were engaged. But that relationship also marked a turning point. Sutcliffe soon decided to leave the Beatles in 1961 to stay in Germany with Astrid and focus on his passion for painting. Tragically, his new life was cut short when he died the following year from a cerebral hemorrhage at just 21 years old. Not long after, another member's story took a painful turn. Pete Best, the band's drummer at the time, was let go in 1962, just as things were starting to change for the group. After securing a recording deal with EMI, they met producer George Martin, and soon after, Best was replaced. The fallout hit him hard. He struggled deeply with depression in the years that followed and even attempted to take his own life before eventually recovering with the support of his family. His relationship with the rest of the band never fully healed, and they rarely spoke again. Still, Best continued playing music, building his own path, while the band he once belonged to went on to change history. Struggles in America. Today, the Beatles are remembered as the driving force behind the British invasion, the band that conquered America and changed pop culture forever. But that success didn't happen overnight. In fact, their early attempts to break into the U.S. were surprisingly rough. At first, even their own record label struggled to get them noticed across the Atlantic. American executives weren't convinced their sound would work, and when their records were finally released, they barely made an impact. Distribution was weak, promotion was almost non-existent, and in one early release, their name was even misspelled as Beatles, a mistake that showed just how little attention they were getting at the time. Things didn't improve right away. A small breakthrough came with a CBS morning news segment in late 1963, which gave them a bit of exposure, but it aired on November 22nd, the same day President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. The news completely overshadowed everything else, and whatever momentum the band might have gained simply vanished. Meanwhile, their early singles like Please Please Me, From Me to You, and She Loves You failed to catch on in the U.S. Some radio listeners even called stations asking them to stop playing the songs, dismissing the band as just another passing trend. It's hard to imagine now, but at that point, the Beatles were far from guaranteed success in America. Everything changed in 1964. Their appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show didn't just introduce them to the American public. It ignited a cultural explosion. Overnight, the same country that had ignored them couldn't get enough, fighting the law. When you look at them next to some of the louder, more rebellious bands that followed, like the Rolling Stones, it's easy to think of the Beatles as the good guys of 1960s pop. And in many ways, that image isn't completely wrong. Compared to others, most of their run-ins with the law were relatively minor and often tied to their use of soft drugs rather than anything more serious. Still, their record wasn't exactly spotless. Earlier in their career, Paul McCartney and Pete Best had already faced trouble in Germany, even being deported after a bizarre incident involving a small fire. As their fame grew, so did the attention from authorities. In the UK, several members found their homes repeatedly searched, largely due to the efforts of a strict drug enforcement officer, Norman Pilcher, who seemed determined to make an example out of high-profile musicians. But it wasn't just British police keeping an eye on them. In 1972, Swedish authorities charged Paul McCartney and his wife Linda after finding marijuana in their possession, resulting in a fine of $2,000. It wouldn't be the last time they found themselves in trouble either. Similar incidents followed in other countries, including Japan and Barbados, the slow death of the Beatles. By the late 1960s, cracks had already started to show within the Beatles. One of the biggest turning points came when John Lennon began bringing Yoko Ono into the band's recording sessions, something that had never happened before. What might have seemed like a personal decision quickly affected the group dynamic, creating distance and discomfort among the others. Things only grew more complicated as Lennon and Ono's relationship deepened and their lifestyle began to change. At the same time, Paul McCartney was becoming more controlling in the studio, pushing his ideas in ways that frustrated the rest of the band. George Harrison, in particular, felt increasingly overlooked, caught between Lennon and McCartney while struggling to have his own voice heard. As tensions built, it reached a breaking point. Harrison walked out of the band on January 10, 1969. Although he eventually returned after some difficult conversations, the atmosphere never truly recovered. Just weeks later, the group gave what would become their final live performance on the rooftop of their Apple Corps building in London, a moment that felt iconic, but also quietly marked the end of something. Behind the scenes, disagreements over money and control only made things worse. By the end of 1969, Lennon had privately decided to leave. McCartney followed soon after, and by 1971, the band that once seemed unbreakable had officially come to an end. Ringo Starr was the first Beatle to leave the band. Although the breakup of the Beatles is often remembered as something publicly confirmed by Paul McCartney, the truth is that tensions had been building for a long time, and every member had their own breaking point. In fact, Ringo Starr was actually the first to walk away, briefly leaving the band in 1968 during the recording of the White Album. At the time, Ringo was struggling with self-doubt about his playing and felt increasingly left out of the group's dynamic. The atmosphere in the studio had become strained, with each member pulling in different directions. In a later interview, he recalled going to both McCartney and John Lennon to explain how isolated he felt, only to be met with a surprising response. Each of them thought he was the one who had grown distant. As Ringo put it, "I thought it was you three." Frustrated and emotionally drained, he decided to step away and took his family to Sardinia for a break. During that time, he began writing what would become Octopus's Garden, finding some peace away from the pressure. Not long after, he received a message from the others telling him how much they missed him and asking him to come back. When Ringo returned to the studio, he was welcomed in a simple but meaningful way. His drum kit had been decorated with flowers, a quiet gesture that said more than words ever could. The post-Beatles world. The breakup of the Beatles hit each member hard, but for Paul McCartney, it was especially painful. In a later interview with BBC Radio 4, he compared it to leaving behind a group of close companions you'd shared everything with, like suddenly being separated from people who had been part of your daily life for years. The loss left him feeling adrift, and he admitted to falling into a period of depression, even turning to alcohol as a way to cope. It wasn't until his wife, Linda, encouraged him to start making music again that he slowly began to find his footing. Meanwhile, both George Harrison and Ringo Starr moved forward with solo careers. They found success in their own ways, but nothing quite matched the global impact they had experienced together. The shadow of the band lingered over everything they did. And even after the split, the emotional tension didn't just disappear. Old frustrations carried over into their personal lives, sometimes surfacing in sharp, public ways. One notable example came in a letter from John Lennon to Paul and Linda, where he didn't hold back, criticizing the band's past while praising the attention he and Yoko Ono were receiving after leaving. A murder on the streets of New York. On the night of December 8, 1980, John Lennon and Yoko Ono went out for dinner near their apartment in New York. When they returned later that evening, they planned to head upstairs and say goodnight to their son, Sean. But as they stepped onto the street, a man named Mark Chapman was waiting. Without warning, he fired 4 shots into Lennon's back. Emergency services rushed him to the hospital, but the injuries were too severe. Despite the efforts of doctors, Lennon was pronounced dead just before midnight. He was only 40 years old. The news sent shockwaves around the world. Fans were stunned, struggling to process how one of the most influential voices in music could be taken so suddenly and violently. Although Yoko Ono chose not to hold a traditional funeral, the grief was undeniable. In both Liverpool and New York, tens of thousands gathered in silence to honor him, while even radio stations paused their broadcasts in tribute. The death of George Harrison. In 1997, George Harrison was diagnosed with throat cancer, an illness widely believed to be linked to his years of smoking. Over the next few years, his health declined as the disease spread. In 2001, he underwent treatment in Switzerland for a brain tumor, followed by radiotherapy in New York after cancer was found in his lungs, and had reached his brain. Despite the seriousness of his condition, those close to him often said he faced it with a sense of calm, shaped by his deep spirituality. On November 29, 2001, Harrison passed away in Los Angeles at the age of 58. His death marked another heartbreaking loss for the Beatles. Paul McCartney later remembered him affectionately as "my baby brother," reflecting the bond they had shared over the years. Ringo Starr also made time to visit him shortly before the end, even while his own family was dealing with a serious illness. By that point, only 2 members of the band remained. Both McCartney and Starr continued their musical journeys in the years that followed, carrying forward the legacy of a group that had already left an unforgettable mark on the world.